The bargain of the last half century or so was politicians saying to the American public, we're going to let factory work go abroad. Don't worry about that. Be bankers, be software engineers. Let China do the dirty jobs, and we'll get a lot of cheap stuff in the meantime. It was a very naive bargain.
There's been a consensus in this country for decades about how the economy should be run.
It's defined by neoliberalism.
The Washington Consensus.
The neoliberal consensus, let's call it that.
Today you reached a new low, I think, by suggesting that manufacturing in America doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where the product is produced.
Congressman, we have the highest standard of living in the world.
No, we do not.
For years, that system looked unstoppable.
It is the economic equivalent of a force of nature.
Until it wasn't.
Your husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio.
The consensus of the last 50 years is collapsing. In its place, something new is taking shape. And the man behind it is not who you'd expect.
Let me start off with two words. Made in America.
Wait, pause. Did you catch that?
Made in America.
Contained in those three words is actually a radical declaration, a plan to transform the American economy.
So if you look at what Biden has done, it is a major, major sea change in how government has worked in the U.S. in the last 40 years.
Joe Biden's policies are an enormous break with a neoliberal consensus.
But to understand what Biden's plan actually is, you have to dive deep into the ideology that has shaped our economy for the last 50 years. For decades after World War II, unionized manufacturing jobs at companies like GE and GM had built the middle class. By 1970, middle-class households were taking home 62% of all income.
So if you were to look in the 1970s at the fortunes of workers, companies in the country, it would kind of move in tandem. They were linked in some way.
By the 1980s, they started to diverge.
There's a lot of deregulation, a lot of changes to tax policy that allow finance to just take off. And one of the great emblems of this is GE. General Electric was one of the oldest corporations in America. It's one of the original innovators. But by the time the 80s and the 90s roll around, Jack Welch, Neutron Jack Welch as he was called, comes in and starts slashing and burning people.
He got rid of 100,000 GE employees.
You were criticized because you got rid of so many people.
Yep.
And you didn't pull back.
No.
You went forward with it.
Harder.
And this is another part of financialization where human beings, workers, are sort of looked at like widgets. Costs on the balance sheet to be moved off so companies can become more efficient, so that share prices can go up.
Under the new paradigm, maximizing share prices was what mattered, and wealth began to shift, away from workers, innovation, and manufacturing, into financial assets like stocks, loans, and real estate.
You know, in the 80s, global capital was unleashed. Well, by the 90s, global trade started to be unleashed.
I was there at the beginning of the whole free trade thing. I saw some of the job losses coming, but I didn't see as many losses as actually did result.
Robert Reich was the Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton when NAFTA was signed into law. NAFTA eliminated trade barriers between the US, Canada, and Mexico.
The advocates of free trade believed that American consumers would benefit from cheaper goods coming from around the world. I was told and repeatedly assured by the advocates for NAFTA that American jobs would be protected by strict labor standards. The fact of the matter is that as labor secretary, every time I went to Mexico to try to enforce the labor standards, nothing happened.
All told, the US lost around 700,000 jobs from NAFTA. But an even bigger shock was about to hit the system. In 2000, Clinton normalized trade relations with China, supporting the country's entry into the World Trade Organization.
The addition of the Chinese economy to the global marketplace will result in a more efficient worldwide allocation of resources and will raise standards of living in China and its trading partners.
Chinese exports flooded America and really were responsible for a large percentage of the losses of manufacturing jobs in the United States.
And when the jobs disappeared, the shops, the banks, the people disappeared too.
Between 1998 and 2021, the U.S. lost more than 5 million manufacturing jobs due to trade policies.
There's no future here. With 75% of your refrigerators being built in Mexico.
They promised basically jobs for our kids if they wanted them. That's not happening.
There was a real Faustian bargain that was made in the 1990s onward. We outsourced our entire industrial commons in exchange for cheap stuff. We decided to stop making things and start consuming things. One of the beauties, in some ways, of the neoliberal system, at least for those that were buying into it, is that it was simple. As long as share prices were going up and consumer prices were going down, there was no problem. As long as companies were getting richer, things were supposedly fine.
Amidst all of that wealth creation, America's middle class saw its share of national income decline.
That's the sort of dirty little secret of neoliberalism, which is that, yeah, the pie got bigger, but fewer people got a slice of it. All the things that make us middle class, education, healthcare, housing, the price of these things didn't go down. Indeed, the price of these things rose. At the same time you get a lot of cheap consumer goods, you also get a cost of living crisis. So it's a very dangerous paradox.
Please welcome the next president of the United States, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
It took, I think, essentially the 2016 election, where both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump critiqued that mainstream view, for policymakers in Washington to really wake up to the reality of what they had wrought.
They say Trump is starting a trade war. I say no. The trade war ended a long time ago, and the United States lost because our leaders didn't take care of our people and our companies. The era of global freeloading and taking advantage of the United States is over. It's just over.
There was a kind of a coming to Jesus moment under Trump, but the problem with the Trump administration is it didn't have any policy prescription for the US itself. It simply said, China's bad, we're gonna slap tariffs on China.
But at the same time, another more ambitious policy plan was being developed elsewhere. A senior advisor to Hillary Clinton was shaken by the loss in 2016. He traveled to Ohio, Colorado, and Nebraska to talk to Americans from across the political spectrum. The result was a report, Foreign Policy for the Middle Class, co-authored by Jake Sullivan.
My national security advisor, I choose Jake Sullivan, and it helps steer what I call a foreign policy for the middle class.
Biden comes in and says, we need an entirely new philosophy of growth.
It's based on a simple premise that will reward work, not wealth in this country.
He's created what some people would call Bidenomics, what some people would call a post-neoliberal world.
I don't buy for 1 second that the vitality of American manufacturing is a thing of the past.
What this means is that he's decided to prioritize not just share prices and not just consumers, but jobs, incomes, communities.
Today, we're getting to work to rebuild the backbone of America. Manufacturing, unions, the middle class.
Over the past 4 years, the Biden administration has quietly translated that worldview into a multi-trillion-dollar set of policies.
You have to go back to the 50s when the statistics were created to find anything comparable to the level of manufacturing investment that we see right now.
That investment can be broken down into 3 pieces of legislation: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law,
a massive infrastructure bill,
the Inflation Reduction Act,
helping to fuel a boom in clean energy all across the United States,
and the CHIPS and Science Act.
Boosting domestic semiconductor production.
We have not seen an infrastructure program this big since the Eisenhower era. We haven't seen ambition that government could do this much, I would argue, since FDR.
Under Biden, investment in manufacturing construction has surged to more than triple the average rate of the 2010s. And those investments are flowing disproportionately to counties where unemployment is highest.
It could be ultimately trillions of dollars that get invested in the economy, targeted not at what private industry is focused on in recent decades, like stock buybacks and other policies that redistribute income upwards. Instead, we're seeing companies invest in real places with real workers for the first time in generations.
How's it been? How's it impacted your life?
Man, tremendously. My life completely changed, man. I got things now that I never thought I could have.
Now we're in a position to where we have 19, 20-year-old people that are working and are thinking about their future.
It sets you up for the future, medical, dental, vision, pension, something to fall back on when it's all over with.
After decades of stagnating wages, these investments are creating well-paid jobs with good benefits. And that's by design.
There's something called the investment tax credit that's a part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Think of it like layers in a cake.
What it does is say that the public sector will help businesses cover 6% of their capital cost if they are just investing in a clean energy technology that we find interesting. But you can get 5 times that amount if you're also paying prevailing wages and running apprenticeship programs. You can get an additional 20% of that if you're investing in a low-income community, 10% if you are investing in a community that's been historically reliant on the fossil fuel industry, and an additional 10% on top of that if you are using made-in-America supply chains. If you take all of the layers in the cake, companies could see up to 70% of their capital cost covered.
These types of policies are an attempt to shift companies away from the financial logic that has dominated corporate behavior for decades.
Take an example like Cleveland-Cliffs. This is one of the country's premier steel manufacturers. In recent decades, they've engaged a lot in stock buybacks to reward their shareholders. Now they're working with the United Steelworker Union to build clean steel in places across the country.
But in a global economy built by decades of free trade, what's to stop jobs like these from getting wiped out again?
You're about to get a clear view of China's capacity to build.
This is a really big moment for the global economy.
The US has accused China of a practice called dumping, flooding the market with a surplus of goods, like electric vehicles or solar panels, at artificially low prices.
We've seen this story before, when the global market is flooded by artificially cheap Chinese products. The viability of American firms is put into question.
China has that surplus in part thanks to years of careful planning and massive government subsidies. But weak environmental and labor standards are also a factor.
The worry is that if we are just importing the lowest cost products, that it will undermine labor standards here at home and undermine the US economy.
Biden has kept Trump's China tariffs in place and recently announced new tariffs on Chinese goods.
I thought Trump was right to put tariffs on China. I think Biden was right to continue them. Not for punitive reasons, but because within the current system, China is not playing by the rules of the game.
The Biden administration's tariffs on China are targeted in the same sectors where it's investing at home, like steel, semiconductors, and clean energy. The goal is to protect the jobs created in those sectors from being undercut by cheaper imports.
You simply cannot say, I'm going to outsource the entire clean energy transition to one country and not have any of those jobs in my own country and expect there to be a country left after that. Just like it took 40 years for neoliberalism to play out, it's going to take many years and even decades for the post-neoliberal era to play out. You look at, for example, in upstate New York, what's happening with the building of a semiconductor industry from the ground up. That's a 10-year process. Big sea changes, like the one we're going through, are complicated. They're complicated to message. It's hard to say we're moving from one political economy to another. That's not something that you message on Fox or MSNBC.
Biden's new economic worldview hasn't been at the center of most political coverage. Instead, we get coverage like this.
During his speech, the president made a gaffe, saying, quote, "Let me start off with 2 words.
Made in America. Made in America."
But there is a coherent policy experiment happening here, a response to decades of neoliberal economics. Whether voters choose to continue that experiment could dramatically shape the future of the American economy.
So I think after one term of Trump and one term of Biden, we have a decent sense of how they're going to govern. Trump broke with the neoliberal era when it came to trade, but he kept in place a lot of neoliberal policies like cutting taxes for the rich and deregulation.
We've tried neoliberalism. What happened during those 45 years was that wages stagnated, Wall Street exploded, big banks got bailouts. Most Americans really came out on the short end. And it pains me to say this because I was part of previous administrations. I was in the Carter administration. I was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. I think that these administrations accomplished a lot of good things. But looking back historically, those administrations did not change the neoliberal consensus. Joe Biden is changing it.
Thank you so much for watching our video. If you'd like to see more stories like this one, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel to get more Perfect Union in your feed. And if you have any ideas for stories that you would like for us to investigate, just drop them in the comments below.